The first speaker is Stephen Starr, Associate of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, former board member and senior scientist for Physicians for Social Responsibility. He's going to talk about nuclear war, an unrecognized mass extinction event waiting to happen.
In 1945, Albert Einstein said, "The release of atomic power has changed everything except our way of thinking." In 2015, 70 years later, we're still stockpiling nuclear weapons in preparation for nuclear war. Our continued willingness to allow huge nuclear arsenals to exist clearly shows that we have not fundamentally grasped the most important truth of the nuclear age, that a nuclear war is not likely to be survived by the human species. A war fought with 21st century nuclear weapons would be more than just a great catastrophe in human history. If we allow it to happen, such a war would be a mass extinction event that ends human history. There's a profound difference between extinction and an unprecedented disaster, or even the end of civilization. Because even after such an immense catastrophe, human life would go on. But extinction, by definition, is an event of utter finality, and a nuclear war that could cause human extinction should really be considered as the ultimate criminal act. It would certainly be the crime to end all crimes. The world's leading climatologists now tell us that nuclear war threatens our continued existence as a species. Their studies predict that a large nuclear war, especially one fought with strategic nuclear weapons, would create a post-war environment in which, for many years, it would be too cold and dark to even grow food. Their findings make it clear that not only humans, but most large animals and many other forms of complex life would likely vanish forever in a nuclear darkness of our own making. The environmental consequences of nuclear war would attack the ecological support systems of life at every level. Radioactive fallout, produced not only by nuclear bombs, but also by the destruction of nuclear power plants and their spent fuel pools, would poison the biosphere. Millions of tons of smoke would act to destroy Earth's protective ozone layer and block most sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. It would create ice age weather conditions that would last for decades. If the political and military leaders who control nuclear weapons strictly avoid any direct public discussion of the consequences of nuclear war, they do so by arguing that nuclear weapons are not intended to be used but only to deter. Remarkably, the leaders of the nuclear weapon states have chosen to ignore the authoritative, long-standing scientific research done by the climatologists, research that predicts virtually any nuclear war, fought with even a fraction of the operational and deployed nuclear arsenals, would leave the Earth essentially uninhabitable. Some of the more recent of these scientific studies appeared in print almost 9 years ago, yet their predictions have not been publicly acknowledged or discussed by any American or Russian president, nor by any of their top military leaders. In fact, none of the current leaders of any of the nations that possess nuclear weapons have ever made such a public acknowledgement. It's not clear that these leaders are even aware of the findings of this research, since they have consistently refused to meet with the scientists who did the studies. No nuclear weapon state has ever attempted to evaluate what consequences the detonation of their nuclear arsenals would have upon the global biosphere and ecosystems. As a result, the grave threat to continued human existence posed by existing arsenals of nuclear weapons is a subject not included in the global debate on nuclear weapons. The existential danger of nuclear war has not been mentioned during American presidential campaigns or debates for more than 40 years. Such considerations have never been included in any military planning or as part of any national strategic review of U.S. military force requirements. Why is this? According to our best scientists, the deployed arsenals of nuclear weapons pose a clear and present danger to the survival of our species. How is it that our leaders are unable or unwilling to even talk about this grave danger? In the 1980s, the American public was generally aware of the existential threat posed by nuclear war. That awareness no longer exists today. This is in part because U.S. public schools do not teach students about nuclear weapons. A couple of generations of Americans have grown up with essentially no knowledge of the effects or consequences of nuclear war. This may be why our political and military leaders continue to focus upon the numbers of nuclear weapons rather than the consequences of their use. This makes no sense when a single ballistic missile can now carry almost 3 times more nuclear explosive power than all the bombs that were detonated during World War II. A universal ignorance of basic nuclear facts ultimately creates a very dangerous situation, because leaders who are unaware that nuclear war can end human history are likely to lack the gut fear of nuclear war that's needed to prevent them from leading us into a nuclear holocaust. You know, I teach a class on nuclear weapons at the University of Missouri, and I get smart students, but virtually none of them that come into my class know anything about nuclear weapons. They don't know the difference between an atomic bomb and a strategic nuclear weapon. They don't know that large arsenals of strategic nuclear weapons even exist. And without this basic knowledge, it's almost impossible for anyone to understand the immense dangers posed by nuclear war. So thus, I'm going to now take a little time to explain these facts to try to ensure that my message today is clear. Atomic bombs were the first nuclear weapons to be invented. It was an atomic bomb that destroyed the Japanese city of Hiroshima at the end of World War II. A typical atomic bomb has an explosive power of about 15,000 tons of TNT, also called 15 kilotons. Atomic bombs are much less powerful than thermonuclear weapons, which were invented in the 1950s. These super bombs often had explosive powers 1,000 times greater than atomic bombs. The photo compares the relative size of the mushroom cloud produced by an atomic bomb to a mushroom cloud produced by a thermonuclear weapon that had an explosive power of 15 million tons of TNT. This was tested by the United States in 1954. Today, thermonuclear bombs are called strategic nuclear weapons, and they generally have an explosive power ranging from 100,000 tons to more than 1 million tons of TNT. Of course, while an atomic bomb is much less powerful than a strategic bomb, it will still completely destroy any city. This graphic illustrates the detonation of an atomic bomb above Midtown Manhattan, where we are now, in the heart of New York City. The solar temperatures of the bomb would almost instantly ignite a nuclear firestorm covering 3 to 5 square miles. It was an atomic bomb of this size, close to this size at least, that destroyed the city of Hiroshima in 1945. It's shocking to see what the atomic bomb did to Hiroshima. More than 4 square miles of the city were utterly destroyed, transforming it into a barren wasteland. However, the firestorm produced by a strategic nuclear weapon is vastly larger than that produced by an atomic bomb. This graphic illustrates the most likely size of a fire zone created by an 800 kiloton strategic nuclear warhead. This graphic shows it being detonated above where we are now in New York. On an average day, the detonation of the warhead would instantly ignite fires over a total area of approximately 90 to 152 square miles. 20 to 30 minutes after the detonation, these fires would have joined together to form a single immense firestorm. Air temperatures in the fire zone would be above the boiling point of water. Hurricane-force winds would blow towards the center of the firestorm, driving the flames horizontally, causing everything remotely flammable to burn. There would be no survivors in the fire zone. Remember, the 800 kilotons equals 800,000 tons of TNT. Russia has 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads that it can launch with less than 15 minutes warning, and 700 of these have an explosive power of 800 kilotons. In a war with the U.S., it would require about 30 minutes for these warheads to hit U.S. cities. So imagine a nuclear war in which hundreds or thousands of such firestorms were ignited in the course of less than 1 hour. There would be hundreds of cities and hundreds of thousands of square miles all burning at the same time. That would probably be one of the first consequences of a U.S.-Russian nuclear war. This is because 93% of the nuclear weapons are owned by the U.S. and Russia. Russia has about 8,000 intact nuclear weapons. The U.S. has about 7,300. France comes next with 300 nuclear weapons, and all the other nuclear weapon states have fewer than that. The U.S. and Russia together maintain a total of more than 800 launch-ready ballistic missiles, which can be fired with less than 15 minutes warning and will strike their targets in 30 minutes or less. Once they're launched, they cannot be recalled from flight. These missiles are armed with a total of about 2,400 strategic nuclear warheads, which have a combined explosive power of approximately 808 million tons of TNT. That's a lot of TNT to visualize, so we need something to compare it to. The small red dot on the left side of this figure represents 2.7 million tons of TNT, which is estimated to be the total explosive power of all the bombs exploded by all the armies of the world during the 5 years of World War II. The large red circle represents 808 million tons of TNT, which is 300 times greater than the explosive power of the bombs exploded in World War II. It would require less than 1 hour for these launch-ready weapons to detonate over their targets. In order to make sure that the U.S. and Russian presidents can give the order to launch their missiles in less than 1 minute, both presidents are constantly accompanied by a military officer carrying a nuclear briefcase. The briefcase contains something similar to a laptop computer, which is designed to transmit the president's order to launch a nuclear strike. The strike goes to the military command, the order goes to the military command centers where the actual launch will be carried out. Another catastrophic consequence of nuclear war is likely to result from the targeting or destruction of nuclear power plants. There are more than 400 commercial nuclear power plants in the world. 100 of them are in the United States, and about 285 are located in Europe and Eurasia. They hold some of the largest concentrations of radioactivity on the planet, and the largest portion of it resides in the used or spent fuel rods. They're stored in spent fuel pools next to the reactors. The rods in the fuel pool contain 5 to 7 times more radioactivity that is inside the nuclear reactor. However, these pools are all located outside the large concrete containment vessels that house the reactors. This means any catastrophic release of radioactivity from the pools will not be contained, but will be released in the atmosphere and the environment. Spent fuel rods continue to produce huge amounts of heat even after they're removed from the reactor core. Thus, spent fuel pools must constantly operate large cooling systems to remove this heat. Otherwise, the water in the pool will eventually overheat and boil off. This must be prevented at all costs because if the spent fuel rods are exposed to steam or air, they will rupture or ignite and release huge quantities of radioactivity. Even if spent fuel pools are not directly targeted in a nuclear war or during wartime, it would probably still be destroyed by the long-term loss of off-site electrical power, which is required to run their cooling systems. In other words, the destruction of the electrical grid in a nuclear war would almost inevitably lead to the failure of the spent fuel cooling systems and the subsequent destruction of the spent fuel they contain. Ruptured or burning fuel rods would release huge amounts of radioactivity, including a radioactive isotope called cesium-137. We unfortunately have had experience with what happens when cesium-137 is released by a catastrophic nuclear accident. The destruction of the Chernobyl reactor, which contained about 3% of the cesium-137 found in most spent fuel pools, created an uninhabitable radioactive exclusion zone, which covers more than 1,100 square miles. If you look at this map of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, it specifies in the key that it's greater than 40 curies per square kilometer is required to make an area uninhabitable. Well, I was studying this some years ago, and I remembered that cesium-137 has 88 curies per gram. So this means that less than half a gram of cesium-137 was made into smoke and spread over a square kilometer. It means you can't live there for centuries. That translates into about 1.2 grams per square mile. American dime weighs 2.7 grams. So you can take half the weight of a dime in cesium-137 and spread it over Central Park, and nobody can live there again for centuries. So many spent fuel pools each contain more than 1 million grams of cesium-137 within their spent fuel rods, and a nuclear war would destroy hundreds of these fuel pools. So this incredible destruction would lead to what scientists describe as a mass extinction event. There's considerable evidence which appears in the fossil records. There have been 5 massive mass extinction events in geologic history. In these events, at least 50% of all animal species were wiped out. Afterwards, it took millions of years for animal life to recover to its previous level of abundance. The most recent of these mass extinction events took place 66 million years ago, when an asteroid about 6 miles in diameter struck the Earth near the Yucatan Peninsula. Its impact vaporized the Earth's crust. It formed a 112-mile wide crater in the Gulf of Mexico, and the superheated material that vaporized in the crater was blasted far above the Earth's atmosphere. and then rained down upon the entire planet. The debris from the asteroid heated Earth's upper atmosphere to about 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to melt steel. For a number of hours, the temperature in the lower atmosphere reached about 700 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dinosaurs were broiled alive. At the same time, all the forests in the world caught fire and burned. The smoke from the burning forest rose above cloud level and into the atmosphere and into the stratosphere, where it surrounded and engulfed the Earth. The smoke formed a global stratospheric smoke layer, which remained in place for many years. I've read that if you would have been there, you could have held your hand in front of your face and you wouldn't have seen it. Because the smoke layer almost completely blocked the warming sunlight, it created ice age weather conditions on Earth. And this period of cold and dark that followed has come to be known as impact winter. The impact winter devastated life on Earth. No land animal larger than a squirrel is believed to have survived the fire and ice from the asteroid. 75% of all the living species of plants and animals that had inhabited Earth became extinct. Well, it was more than 30 years ago when scientists began warning that a nuclear war would also create a global stratospheric smoke layer, which would cause a nuclear winter, similar to impact winter. New studies show that the original 1980s research actually underestimated the consequences of nuclear war. Nuclear winter resembled impact winter in many basic ways. In a nuclear war, hundreds of thousands or thousands of nuclear detonations would ignite immense nuclear firestorms. And these would produce as much as 150 or 180 million tons of smoke. This smoke would rise above cloud level and encircle the Earth. Because the smoke could not be rained out, it would remain in the stratosphere for decades. There it would lead to the destruction of most of Earth's protective ozone layer, while it would also block warming sunlight from reaching the surface of the Earth. The loss of the protective ozone layer would vastly increase the amount of harmful ultraviolet light reaching Earth. The loss of warming sunlight would create weather conditions colder than those experienced at the height of the last ice age. And temperatures would fall below freezing every day for 1 to 3 years in the continental interiors of North America and Eurasia. Growing seasons would be eliminated for at least a decade or longer. Nothing would grow, including the food crops that we depend upon, and most humans and animals would starve to death. The animated graphic here was produced by Dr. Luke Ullmann of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, and it illustrates 150 million tons of smoke entering the stratosphere after a war fought with the strategic nuclear arsenals of the US and Russia. In less than 2 weeks, the smoke surrounds the Earth. In a few more weeks, smoke acts to block 70% of all sunlight reaching the surface of the northern hemisphere. The illustration of a farmer standing in his ruined cornfield gives you some idea of how dark a cloudless sky in North America would appear following a war fought with strategic nuclear weapons. On a cloudy day at noon, the light levels would be similar to what we would experience now at midnight during a full moon. This image was adapted from an article published in 2009 by Scientific American, written by Drs. Toon and Robach, a few years after they had published their peer-reviewed studies that warned of the existential dangers of nuclear war. In 2011, Dr. Robach wrote in Nature magazine that he had made multiple requests to meet with officials of the Obama administration so that he and Dr. Toon could discuss the findings of their studies. All of his requests were denied. I could provide a lot more information and examples of leaders refusing to meet with scientists who only wish to warn them about the grave dangers posed by nuclear war. But further proof is unnecessary, simply because of the fact that none of the leaders of the nuclear weapon states have publicly acknowledged that a war fought with their nuclear arsenals could end human history. It's time for them to do so. And it's time for us to demand that they do so. The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. Don't be one of them. Please do whatever you can to help prevent nuclear war. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. He's got a cold, that's why his voice sounded a bit funny. So he came and gave his speech. And he's just had a paper published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist about an 800 kiloton bomb dropping on New York. I would advise you all to read that. The next speaker is Bruce Gagnon. Bruce is coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, where he offers his own reflections on organising and the state of America's declining empire. His title is The Ongoing Dangerous Militarisation of Space and Nuclear War. Bruce.
I live in Bath, Maine, where Navy destroyers are built. These ships are outfitted with so-called missile defense systems that the Pentagon is today using to help encircle Russia and China. Few people in our community, including activists, are interested in where these ships go or what their military mission actually is, especially when Bath Iron Works is the largest industrial employer in our state. Soon after George W. Bush became president, he pulled the U.S. out of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM treaty that we had with Russia. That treaty limited the deployment of missile defense systems that are key elements in U.S. first strike attack planning. This led to the creation of the Missile Defense Agency, and today we see U.S. deployments of missile defense systems on the land and on board Navy ships being used to surround Russia and China. Each year, the U.S. Space Command conducts a computer war game in which they practice a first strike attack on Russia and China. They call it the blue team against the red team. And in this war game, the first weapon, an attack on China, is the successor to the space shuttle, the military space plane, that during testing has shown that it can stay in orbit for over a year without a pilot on board. It's really a super drone. In the computer war game, the military space plane drops down back towards Earth and hits China. Other weapon systems under the direction of Strategic Command's Prompt Global Strike program are then used in a further strike. When Russia and China in this war game attempt to fire their remaining nuclear forces, our missile defense systems are used to pick off any retaliatory strike, thus giving the Pentagon a quote-unquote successful first strike attack. Thus, missile defense, or should we call it missile offense, is the shield that is used after the U.S. first strike sword is thrust into the heart of another nation. Russia and China have repeatedly said that any hopes for real nuclear disarmament are out the door as long as the U.S. continues to test and deploy these missile offense systems. They are destabilizing and make the reality of launch on warning more of a problem than ever. Greg Mello from the Los Alamos Study Group, a speaker later, reports that modernization of nuclear weapons, now underway at Sandia Labs and elsewhere, is creating dramatic new instabilities in U.S.-Russian nuclear affairs. What is billed in Washington as necessary modernization and repair is really quite a serious new arms race underway against a backdrop of expanding missile defense deployments. Today, the U.S. is deploying land-based and sea-based missile defense systems, including radars, in Romania, Poland, and Turkey, and on ships in the Baltic, Mediterranean, and eventually the Baltic, Barents, and Bering Seas. These deployments are directly aimed at Russia, although the Pentagon claims that they are intended for Iran, which we know is not true. Coupled with the hyper-aggressive NATO expansion up to the Russian border, Moscow has been forced into a red alert corner. Just this week, the U.S. Army 2nd Cavalry Regiment, driving armored personnel carriers and other military vehicles, rolled through the streets of Narva, Estonia, just 300 yards from the Russian border. a dramatic escalation of the insane Pentagon military confrontations that are being aimed at Russia, that are being created, rather, in Eastern Europe. The U.S. is just poking Russia to get a response. Imagine if the reverse were happening and Russia was deploying military forces in Canada or Mexico. We'd go freaking ballistic. The U.S. NATO-directed coup in Ukraine has led to a civil war that is intended to create chaos on Russia's border. The eventual goal is regime change in Moscow, all to benefit corporations that want to control the largest supply of natural gas on the planet, sitting under Russian soil. Couple that with the melting Arctic ice, which has fossil fuel extraction corporations drooling at the thought of control of the Arctic region. The U.S. Navy recently sent a nuclear submarine into the Arctic, with New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman along for the ride. In his column afterward, he quoted Jonathan Greenert, the chief of naval operations, saying, quote, "In our lifetime, what was in effect land and prohibitive to navigate or explore is becoming an ocean, and we'd better understand it. We need to be sure that our sensors, weapons, and people are proficient in this part of the world so that we can own the undersea domain and get anywhere there," unquote. Just take a look at a map and note that Russia has the largest land border with the Arctic Ocean. At the same time, these missile defense systems are being positioned in South Korea, Japan, Okinawa, Guam, Taiwan, and on Aegis destroyers throughout the Pacific Ocean. They're aimed at China, though similarly, Washington claims they're in response to North Korea, which we know is a lie. Last October, I organized a peace walk through Maine to help shine a light on our state's growing dependence on military spending. We began the walk up in the beautiful mountain and lakes region called Rangeley, where the Pentagon's Missile Defense Agency is considering putting up to 60 ground-based missile defense interceptors. Narrow, winding roads would have to be bulldozed and widened, and huge holes would have to be blasted into the mountains in order to insert the missile silos. Toxic rocket fuel would be trucked in and stored on site, the same rocket fuel that is now contaminating water sources in 22 states across the nation. The whole plan would be an environmental disaster and would cost taxpayers more than $4 billion. Come to find out, the Pentagon didn't want this expensive program, but pressure on Congress from the Boeing Corporation forced it to go forward with an environmental impact statement process and public hearings in 4 states, including Maine, to select a possible East Coast deployment site for a missile defense base. Another major weapons program being built that the Pentagon did not actually want is also in Maine. General Dynamics owns Bath Iron Works, where destroyers for the Navy are built. The standard Aegis destroyer cost about $1.5 billion and are outfitted with these missile defense interceptor missiles, which have had much success in their testing program. But after Obama became president, he forced the Navy to build the new high-tech stealth destroyer called the Zumwalt, the job of which is to sneak up on China and blast it with new electromagnetic rail guns and other weapon systems. This is part of Obama's pivot of 60% of U.S. military forces into the Asia-Pacific to provocatively confront and control China. As it turns out, the majority stockholders in General Dynamics are the Crown family from Chicago, who helped Obama get elected to the presidency. So he owed them, and the new Zumwalt stealth destroyer, at a cost of taxpayers of between $4 and $6 billion each, is their reward. As part of the U.S. pivot to China, the Pentagon needs more airfields for warplanes, more barracks for troops, and more ports of call for the warships being redeployed into the region. So in places like Jeju Island, South Korea, we see a 500-year-old fishing and farming culture being torn apart, and UNESCO-recognized World Heritage soft coral reefs just offshore being destroyed as a Navy base is being built for U.S. nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and the destroyers made in my hometown of Bath. In the U.S. today, more than 60% of every federal discretionary tax dollar goes to the Pentagon to fund the cancerous war machine. Our communities have become addicted to military spending as our physical and social infrastructure continues to deteriorate. There is virtually no money for anything else these days as we witness austerity cuts in social programs all over the nation. The Pentagon says that America's role under corporate globalization of the world economy will be security export. We won't have conventional jobs making things useful to our communities anymore. Instead, we'll build weapons for endless war and send our kids overseas to die for the fossil fuels corporation. In fact, today, weapons are the #1 industrial export product of the nation. And when weapons are your #1 industrial export product, what is your global marketing strategy for that product line? What does it say about the soul of our nation that we have to keep selling weapons and killing people in order to provide jobs so workers can feed their families? The Pentagon has the largest carbon bootprint on the planet, but sadly there is little acknowledgement of that fact by most climate change groups, which well illustrates to me the off-limits nature of the growing military domination of our society. We've become an occupied nation. The corporate oligarchy that runs the show in Washington uses space-based technologies to spy on us and to direct all warfare on the planet. In a way, you could call today's expensive military satellites the triggers that make the high-tech weapons like drones and offensive missiles work. These satellites allow the military to see everything, to hear everything, and to target every place on the planet. We're sold the line that high-tech robotic warfare will save American lives and will be a cheaper way to fight. The military-industrial complex has become the primary resource extraction service for corporate globalization and is preparing the future generations for its dead-end street of perpetual war. Due to the fiscal crisis across the nation, engineering departments, computer science, mathematics, astronomy, and chemistry departments in colleges and universities have become increasingly dependent on Pentagon funding. In the U.S., approximately 40% of all scientists, engineers, and technical professionals today work in the military sector. This is a colossal waste of talent and intellectual resources as we face the coming reality of climate change. Another key reason for the militarization of space is resource extraction on the planetary bodies. One of the Space Command jobs will be to control the pathway on and off the planet Earth. Some years ago, the Congress commissioned a study, and it was published, called Military Space Forces, the Next 50 Years. And in there, this book, it was published as a book, signed by the likes of John Glenn and Senator Bill Nelson from Florida. They talked about controlling the Earth-Moon gravity well, controlling who could get on and off the planet Earth, and that with control of the Earth-Moon gravity well, we would be able to hijack rival shipments upon return. The aerospace industry says it needs nuclear power in space for mining the sky. Nuclear reactors on rockets will be needed to give them the kind of lift capability to reach Mars. International space law is now being rewritten by corporate interest to allow their control of the planetary bodies. The industry plan is to scrap the United Nations moon and outer space treaties. Rovers on Mars today are currently powered by plutonium-238. I organized campaigns to oppose nuclear launches from the Space Center in Florida in 1989, 1990, and 1997. Future mining colonies on the planetary bodies would be nuclear-powered, necessitating a host of launches of nuclear materials into space on rockets that blow up from time to time. Space entrepreneur Elon Musk says we must move our civilization to Mars. The Mars Society says that the Earth is a rotting, stinking, dying planet, and that we have to terraform Mars to make it habitable. Imagine how much money that would cost. When the Civil War and the Indian Wars ended, the military-industrial complex at the time saw an end to their massive war profits. They needed an enemy to keep the military production lines humming. So a strategy was developed. Journalists and artists were paid to fabricate stories about Crazy Horse, the great Lakota warrior who had been brought onto the reservation in South Dakota in 1877. They reported that Crazy Horse had broken out of the reservation and gone back on the warpath, killing innocent white children, raping white women, and burning their houses to the ground. These stories were printed in major newspapers across the nation, and the American people were afraid and outraged. Congress swung into action and appropriated more money for weapons production, while Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull sat inside their teepees on the reservation without a gun to their names. Similarly, in our time, we've seen the military-industrial complex fabricate stories about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And today we see ISIS, which has been trained, armed, and funded by the CIA, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, as the justification for the U.S. to get back into Iraq and bomb Syria. Putin has been demonized by the Western media, creating the false notion that he is on the warpath to recreate the former Soviet Union. Studies by the Economics Department of UMass Amherst reveal that military spending creates the fewest jobs, while spending on solar, rail, wind turbines, education, healthcare, or repairing sewer and water systems and our crumbling roads and bridges creates many more jobs with the same amount of money. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass reminded us that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. When it comes to our current dark, evil economic system called militarism, we should be demanding its conversion and the jobs that would result from that transformation. Without massive cuts in the Pentagon budget, how can we ever kickstart our needed social transformation? The militarization of everything around us is a spiritual sickness. Lakota holy man Lame Deer talked about the green frog skin, the dollar bill, and how the white man was blinded by his love for the paper money. His spiritual connection to the Mother Earth was broken. It's time to repair the sacred hoop. The integration of the economic conversion issue into the existing work of the peace, environmental, labor, and social justice movements could be a transformative strategy that would unify our disparate efforts and provide the despondent American people with a positive vision for the future. We don't have time to waste. Let me just make this announcement that the Npt Review Conference at the UN will be happening this spring. 1,000 Japanese people are coming here as part of that. 4 peace walks from throughout the U.S. will merge into New York City at that time. A rally and march will be held here in the city on April 26th, and nonviolent civil resistance action will be held on April 28th. For more information, there's literature on the tables in the coffee room, or check with the War Resisters League. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Bruce, for making an adequate diagnosis. As physicians, we have to look at etiology of disease. Etiology means the cause of a disease. So unless you find you isolate a poliovirus, you can't prevent polio, which Jonas Salkin Sabine did. Therefore, we're looking at the etiology of killing and the etiology of possible nuclear extinction. That's what this conference is about. The next speaker is Bill Hartung from the Centre for International Policy. He's the author of Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex, Nation Books 2011, and co-editor with Miriam Pemberton of Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War, Paradigm Press 2008. His previous books include Weapons for All, HarperCollins, a critique of US arms sales policies from the Nixon through Clinton administrations. From July 2007 through March 2011, he was the director of the Arms and Security Initiative at the New American Foundation. Prior to that, he served as a director of the Arms Trade Resource Center at the World Policy Institute. He also worked as a speechwriter and policy analyst for the New York State Attorney General Robert Abrams. Bill Hartung's articles on security issues have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times, The Nation, and World Policy Journal. He's also a featured expert on national security issues. His title is Inordinate Power and Pathological Dynamics of the U.S. Military-Industrial Complex.
Bruce covered a lot of ground, and my presentation is going to be a bit narrower. It's really about the politics of the military-industrial complex, and he gave some good examples of that. But the term military-industrial complex itself, as you know, came from President Eisenhower's farewell address. And so the first question is, why did he choose to make his last words to the nation about this issue? And I think ultimately, the part of the speech that people are most familiar with has to do with unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. But I think perhaps more important is the ending of the speech, where he talks about it as a threat to democracy. And he said, "We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together." I'm not sure how big a machine we need to mesh with, but nonetheless, the spirit of it was that life and death decisions were being made in an undemocratic way. And I think that's really what drove the speech. Now, nuclear weapons were not only present at the creation of the military-industrial complex, but they were an integral part of how it came to be and how it came to be sustained. Of course, the Manhattan Project, which was one of the largest industrial undertakings in human history, created the base for a lot of what we see now as the nuclear warhead complex. So, in any case, not only do we have the Manhattan Project setting the sort of infrastructure of the nuclear arms race, but Eisenhower tangled with the nuclear lobby continuously, and that was really what led him to get the concept of the military-industrial complex. The Air Force and the industry wanted to build a new bomber, a new nuclear bomber, the B-70. Eisenhower didn't think it was necessary, but he had to fight tooth and nail against it, even to the point where his own generals were giving testimony against him. You know, the theory is supposed to be there's a commander-in-chief, they make a decision, and the military folks walk in line. But in this case, they were talking out of school and challenging their own president to build a bomber that we did not need. So that was his first indication that this complex was getting out of hand. But more importantly, and perhaps more unfortunately, he was blindsided by the missile gap controversy late in his term. There was faulty intelligence circulated by industry, by folks in the Air Force and elsewhere, that we were far behind the Soviet Union in the production of ballistic missiles. And the Sputnik launch was used as kind of the scare tactic to build that infrastructure, that argument. There was even a column written by Joseph Alsop, who was a Cold War journalist, claiming that in a few years' time, the Soviet Union would have 1,000 ICBMs to about 100 by the United States. Now, it's not clear he had any source for this, but it was widely broadcast, including John F. Kennedy using those statistics in a speech on the floor of the Senate. And in fact, the Democratic senators like Stewart Simonton and Kennedy and LBJ were attacking Eisenhower from the right on the issue of a nuclear buildup. And he eventually was pushed in that direction, although not nearly as far as the military-industrial complex would have liked him to be. And of course, the end of the story was Kennedy comes into power. We find out there is no missile gap except for the one in which the United States is far ahead of the Soviet Union. So that whole manipulation of intelligence and the push by industry and ideologues and the opposing party to go to war has been replicated many times since, perhaps most clearly in the run-up to the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq in 2003. We've got the role of the military-industrial complex in that early phase, and nuclear weapons as the key part of it. Then I'm going to fast forward to the end of the Cold War, because here seemed to be an opportunity to dismantle that complex. There was no Soviet adversary. Colin Powell gave an interview in which he said, "I'm running out of enemies," which you would think would be a good thing, but for the military-industrial complex was a threat. And so they evolved a doctrine where they took regional threats as defined by the complex, like Iraq, like North Korea, and used them as the building blocks to keep a large military. And of course, within this, we had the genesis of the Iraq War Party, the Project for the New American Century, which was a network that included people like Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, all the main architects of the Iraq War. And the executive director of that organization was Bruce Jackson, who was a vice president for the Lockheed Martin Corporation. So a disinterested party, you might say. The PNAC and the ideologues around them, once 9/11 came, decided that atmosphere of fear that followed that was their moment to move on their agenda, which they did. And so we're living with the consequences of that, the tens and hundreds of thousands of people who were casualties in the Iraq War, the trillions of dollars of our resources that were spent on that in a country that now everybody's telling us we're broke. If we had that money, even the hardest of deficit hawks couldn't point to a deficit because we wouldn't have one. That was sort of an example of the military-industrial complex overcoming a threat, the threat of peace. And I would just like to talk a little bit about their tools of influence that they use, and currently to sustain their position. And of course, first on any list is campaign contributions. And the arms industry gave about $50 million to candidates for Congress and the presidency in the last 3 election cycles. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but it's only about 1/4 of what Wall Street gives. It's a tiny fraction of the $1 billion the Koch brothers are hoping to spend on the next election. And the reason for that is that campaign spending is just one tiny element of all the levers of influence that the industry has. So it doesn't lean on campaign spending as much as some other industries would do. But when they do give money, they target it very carefully. So for example, Buck McKeon who until recently was the head of the House Armed Services Committee, who I call the one-man military-industrial complex. Got $750,000 over a 3-cycle period from the arms industry. All its biggest contributors were Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Northrop Grumman. They were developing stealth technology in his district, as well as the largest drone producer in the world, General Atomics. So keeping Buck happy went a long way towards promoting their agenda. And when he announced he was going to retire, Mac Thornberry from Texas, who's going to take over, has taken over as head of Armed Services, immediately got a flood of additional donations from these same companies. So they know who to give the money to. And then, in addition to that, we have lobbying expenditures, which are an unbelievable flood of money. The industry spent $680 million over that 3-cycle period I talked about. And perhaps more important, they average anywhere from 800 to 1,000 lobbyists. So that means almost 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress. And in fact, some staffers I've talked to whose bosses aren't even that directly involved in defense say that they can spend 20% or more of their time just talking to or fending off lobbyists from the weapons industry. Then you've got the revolving door, which is when people of influence in government go to work for industry, and then they influence their former colleagues on behalf of industry. Or people from industry go into government and make decisions that help their old employers. William Proxmire, who was probably one of the most notable gadflies in the history of the US Senate, talked about the revolving door in 1969. So it's been around for quite a while. And his definition, I think, is hard to really beat. He said in a speech in 1969, "The easy movement of high-ranking military officers into jobs with major defense contractors and the reverse movements of top executives and major defense contractors into high Pentagon jobs is solid evidence of the military-industrial complex in action. It is a real threat to the public interest because it increases the chances of abuse. How hard a bargain will officers involved in procurement planning or specifications drive when they are 1 or 2 years of retirement away from working in the industry, along with 2,000 of their fellow officers who've already gone there?" And we've had many examples of this, procurement officers giving a cushy deal to companies that they know they're going to go to work for. The only example where anybody actually paid a price was a tanker program that John McCain got his teeth into, and an executive from Boeing and the contractor, the executive in the Pentagon who helped them out actually did jail time. Now, it was probably at Club Fed, but it was still jail time. And it was an indication of something that happens all the time being punished in some small way. Now, the other tool that's used is the funding of think tanks. I think of this as political money laundering. Instead of the head of Lockheed Martin going on TV and saying, "You need our weapons," you have a seeming expert from someplace like the Center for Security Policy, or the Lexington Institute, or Heritage, or the American Enterprise Institute, pushing weapon systems and beating the drums for war, funded by the industry. So they're sort of front groups in a sense. And my 3 favorites, of which there are many to choose from, are the Center for Security Policy, which was started by a guy named Frank Gaffney. He left the Reagan administration because he was too conservative for them. And he immediately took hordes of contractor money to support Star Wars. And that was his major issue for many, many years. And he would give awards to people like Donald Rumsfeld called the Keeper of the Flame Award. I think he meant the flame of freedom, but I think it's more about us burning up as a result of his activities. So there's also a place called the National Institute for Public Policy, which really wrote the template of George W. Bush's nuclear posture. And they had a Boeing executive on their advisory board, and they were run by a guy named Keith Payne, whose main claim to fame, I think, is an article he wrote in 1980 about nuclear weapons and nuclear war, which said, "Victory is possible, and we should plan accordingly." so that, maybe we would lose 10, 20, 30, 50 million people, but we could still win. So this is the kind of person who is influencing Bush, funded by the contractors. Then there's the Lexington Institute, and they have a guy named Lauren Thompson, who's the expert of choice for the press to get ideas about new weapon systems, strategy, and so forth. His think tank is funded by Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. He does consulting for them. For many years, this was not known to people. He was never identified as such in the press. Some of us questioned that, and now they do at least mention that he's an industry consultant, and he himself mentions it in his columns for Forbes magazine. But nonetheless, he's a spokesperson, essentially, for the weapons industry, but ensconced in a think tank that's supposed to give him this aura of objectivity. As was mentioned by Bruce, the argument of last resort is jobs, jobs, jobs. But you can create more jobs doing literally anything else. Even a tax cut creates 25% more jobs than putting money into weapon systems. So, but this argument has worked very well for them when they can't make the argument that we need these weapons to defend us. And I took a look at just one example, the F-35 combat aircraft, and Lockheed Martin said, we've got 125,000 jobs in 46 states, so good luck trying to stop us. But in fact, I looked at their numbers. There were fewer than half as many jobs as they claimed, and most of them were concentrated in Texas and California. They weren't sprinkled all over the country like they argued. So in fact, that jobs argument, part of it is smoke and mirrors. There's no question that it's there, it has an impact in very important places, but they don't blanket the country. There's a lot of places that are paying in and not getting any money back from the military buildup. And the nuclear complex itself, of course, is spread widely. There are elements of the warhead complex in California, New Mexico, Nevada, Texas, Missouri, Tennessee, and South Carolina. And that's just for the warhead complex. To build the delivery vehicles like subs and bombers, there's Connecticut, Southern California. To put the missiles in the ground, there's North Dakota, there's Wyoming, there's Montana. And then there's bases in Georgia and Washington State for the subs. So they have Netflix spread it around, and certainly they can motivate the Congress people from those districts on their behalf. But I do believe, despite that the military-industrial complex is not all-powerful, and that we can dismantle it if we work hard enough at it and mobilize enough people to do so. There's one more example of corporate influence I wanted to talk about, and it's something I call party favors. There's a very fine symphony orchestra in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is little known, but the reason there is such a good orchestra there is because it's in the district of the late Representative Jack Murtha, who was one of the masters of pork barrel politics in Congress. In fact, the headline of his obituary called him that. So that was how important it was in his life in Congress. So anyway, the Johnstown Orchestra was his wife's favorite charity. The companies poured the money in as another way to curry favor with him. So it's sort of like any little angle they can find, they will use it. The University of Mississippi has something called the Trent Lott Leadership Institute, which sounds sort of like a contradiction in terms, but nonetheless it exists. And Lockheed Martin gave $1 million to help get that thing running when Trent Lott was the majority leader of the Senate. More recently, Buck McKeon's wife, Patricia, decided to run for the state legislator in the state of California, which costs a lot of money. And her big issue was she wanted them to stop charging for plastic bags at the supermarket. So lo and behold, Lockheed Martin and Boeing and others decided, we too are against paying for plastic bags at the supermarket. And that's why we're gonna fund Buck McKeon's wife to run for the California state legislature. And they said this with a straight face when people asked them about the contributions, but of course it doesn't pass the laugh test. But it was yet another way to sort of circumvent what limited curbs there are left on political money to curry favor with a powerful legislature who's got his hands on the money spigot for the military-industrial complex. This is the controversial part of my remarks, in the sense that, I don't know how many people believe this, but I certainly believe it myself, which is that the military-industrial complex is not 10 feet tall. We can beat it politically, and we shouldn't let this notion that they're all powerful demobilize people when we're trying to get, when we're pursuing, life-saving objectives like getting rid of nuclear weapons. So these are small examples, but I think they're indicative of what's possible. When Lockheed Martin wanted to keep Obama from canceling the F-22, he signed up 200 members of the House, 44 senators, many governors, the unions involved, to write to Obama and press him to keep building this thing. But because of pressure from non-governmental groups and the fact that Obama actually stood up and threatened to veto something, they were able to stop that. And the industry just assumed they were going to win. In fact, everybody assumed that. The press assumed it, many of my colleagues assumed it, and it's a small thing in that ocean of money that they get. But I think it's indicative of that they can be beat. The second example is the caps on Pentagon spending, which have been in place since the Budget Control Act. Now, we can talk about how the industry's been getting around that by stuffing money in the war budget that's not related to the wars. But nonetheless, they're going to get $1 trillion less over the next decade than they wanted. So they're not getting their wish list. And this was driving them insane. So they had a huge campaign that said our economy was going to collapse if we made these modest cuts in Pentagon spending. They said we'd lose 1 million jobs. Well, in fact, many of the cuts were made, employment increased. That 1 million job loss never happened. And it's actually gotten to the point where even some members of Congress are a little skeptical that, lo and behold, maybe these people have been lying to us all these years. Finally, because these things are so expensive and because our country has so many other needs, I think that's another source of support. And I see it, there's actually it's kind of a right-left convergence here. On the left, we know that our country needs many, many things, more than we need to spend $1 trillion on nuclear delivery vehicles over the next couple decades. On the right, there's a little sort of caucus that says, well, actually, the Pentagon is part of government. And so if you want smaller government, you have to reduce the Pentagon. Now, I view those as kind of allies of convenience. Obviously, there's many other things on their agenda that I couldn't possibly sign up to. But it's an interesting period in Washington. And I think as people get mobilized around these issues and related issues like campaign finance reform and climate change, I think we'll find that the Washington power system is somewhat in disarray. And that may give us some opportunities that we didn't have in the past to push our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Much food for thought. This is to all the panelists. Since Western civilization got us into this mess, does Western civilization deserve to continue? Can we replace it with a better civilization? To all the panelists.
Yes. I mean, there's no question we can do better, and we need to. But I mean, Western civilization is obviously a broad concept, and there's many things that we would want to keep. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, democratic processes, which are under threat now from many sources, be it NSA spying, be it the flood of money into our politics. The national surveillance state is as frightening as the military-industrial complex, and they do overlap. But I think this notion that the United States has all the answers and it's up to us to save the world, or some people who are more honest to clean up the mess we help create, I think undermines our efforts. Internationally, there's a huge mobilization. There's people with amazing ideas, and we need to make that part of our agenda, part of how we think about these things.
Stephen.
Well, I look at what's going on in the world, and what we hear is supposed to be news, and it just seems like propaganda to me anymore. I don't think we have a democratic republic. I think we have an oligarchy. And I think that if we are not selective you know, I've gotten to where whatever I hear, I'm not sure. I have to think, is that true? Cui bono, who benefits from it? So Western civilization is, I'd rather start off with what do we have right now and how do we fix it? And, you know, Bruce had talked about, I mean, we've exported our industrial base overseas and replaced it with military hardware. That's our biggest industrial export, you know. And so people don't, the middle class is gone because there's no good jobs, and there's no tax base. So now the Federal Reserve, the government's creating trillions and trillions of dollars electronically, and they use that to fund all the wars. So let's look at those kind of issues, I think, first. That's what I'd say.
I think the only hope we have is the end of our arrogance, the way we lecture other countries about you can't have nuclear weapons while we're building new generations and building space technology for war fighting, full spectrum dominance. And this idea of American exceptionalism, that we're essentially better than everyone else, and that we know better than everyone else, and everyone else should get on their knees and follow us. When we can end that as a kind of a national way of thinking, then maybe there'll be a chance for the planet. And I think all of us have a role and a responsibility in these moments to talk about that and how dysfunctional and dangerous these attitudes are. You know, as evidenced recently by U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, her comments that were printed in the Bild newspaper in Germany when she was having a fit about Angela Merkel's and Hollande's meeting with Putin about ending the Ukrainian civil war that the United States and NATO are really responsible for. And she was just going on and on, apparently, in this meeting with other administration people and Pentagon officials, and just trashing Merkel. And apparently the report is that German intelligence released this information to their own newspapers, and it was printed and it's been now shared across the country, but sadly and unfortunately not in any papers in the United States that I've been aware of. But it's this kind of attitude that is represented at very high levels within our own administration, that anyone else in the world that is trying to stand against our policies of endless war has to be trashed and destroyed, even if it's someone as high as the Chancellor of Germany.
Thank you. The next question is, will the obvious privatization of space serve as negative feedback for its militarization? Since people like Elon Musk and Richard Branson have no interest in that militarization, as opposed to how privatization of the military has encouraged a push toward war. Do you understand that? The people who want to privatize space to be used to make money, are they clashing with the military use of space to create war and destroy the planet?
So far, I haven't seen any of those people, the space privatizers. I haven't seen them questioning any aspects of space militarization. In fact, I've seen the opposite amongst some of them, that in fact they favor it. And again, they largely favor it because they see the need for the creation of a front gate, if you will, a gate between the Earth and the planetary bodies. Who's going to control the gate? Who's going to control the pathway off the planet? Because so many different countries now, and even private corporations, are saying they want to go out and mine the sky. You know, we're told, don't worry about the fact we're running out of resources here on Earth, because we can get all we need in space. Magnesium, cobalt, uranium on Mars, helium-3, water on the moon, gold on the asteroids, etc. But who's going to have access to that? Because the UN treaties say that the planetary bodies are the province of all humankind. and no corporation, no individual, no country can own them. That's why they're trying to rewrite space law. And so many of these people are very much in favor of the militarization of space because it would allow them to be the good guys and to be authorized to go out and control the planetary bodies because they're from this country that has the technology to control space. So I see it as a dangerous relationship.
Thank you. Stephen Starr, why have we banned chemical and biological weapons and the like, but not nuclear weapons? Is it the connection to nuclear power?
That's a good question. And I don't really have a definitive answer, but I see that what the deterrence is the policy that all the nuclear weapon states use to base everything they do on. The nuclear arsenals are the cornerstone of what they do. And so I think that they've been less willing to give up nuclear weapons because, but that's why I was trying to talk about in my talk, is that they don't seem to perceive that if they, how can you say, well, we have these weapons and they make us safe and it's national security, but a single failure of nuclear deterrence will kill us all. But they don't want to talk about that. And it's if you believe deterrence will work perfectly forever, well, who's the eternal optimist? The people that believe deterrence will work perfectly forever, or the people like us that want to get rid of nuclear weapons before they get rid of us? So, but I think maybe biological and chemical are seen as less strategic. They're easier to get rid of and still keep the real weapons.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to say that we're dealing with psychological insanity.
Yeah.
Because if we have patients who are suicidal, we hospitalize them. And we're all suicidal, walking like lemons towards a cliff of nuclear annihilation, practicing psychic numbing. Anyway, someone's asked, please explain launch on warning for those who don't understand. Bruce, do you want to do that? Launch on warning.
What was it you asked?
Please explain launch on warning or hair
Launch on
trigger
warning.
alert for those who do not understand.
Well, I like to use the term launch-ready nuclear weapons because the military's had a big fit in the past about the idea of launch on warning, because they say, no, we're always in control of these weapons. And the idea that we would just launch them on warning is ridiculous. We make the decision when to launch. But, those sorts of decisions, as we heard earlier today, artificial intelligence can come in, cyber warfare can come in, where there's things are going so fast that we might decide it's better to let machines decide what's really important. But the launch on warning, the basic idea of that is that you would launch each side has got nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles that they can launch and can hit their targets in 30 minutes or less and be launched in 15 minutes or less. So there's a time frame there. And both sides have to, and the US and the Soviet Union and now Russia are the two countries that maintain this capability. They each have radar, and although we heard that the Russian radar is pretty piecemeal, we have actually satellite systems. But if these systems electronically detect a launch, then the alert is passed up the chain of the command, and if at some point it's decided that it's a valid alert, then the decision is made whether to launch before the weapons come in and hit you. And the idea is that it's always been, well, we will launch before they hit us, and therefore we can take out the other side. And the thing that's been lost in the process is that if the purpose of nuclear weapons is deterrence, that once an attack is actually launched, deterrence has already failed, and there's going to be immense destruction regardless of what happens. And if it's an accidental nuclear war, if you're basing your idea that you're going to launch these weapons strictly on electronic signals and they're false, then your retaliatory launch is actually a preemptive launch. You just started the nuclear war yourself. So it's a very dangerous thing. And the last thing I want to say is that if deterrence is based on the idea of unacceptable retaliation, then it shouldn't be based on the idea that you have to deliver it in 15 minutes. It's just that it's there. And what really has happened is that it was the Soviet Union and now Russia and the United States have what they call counterforce theory. And this is a preemptive theory. So in the event of a military conflict, for example, if the US gets into a direct military conflict with Russia and Ukraine or NATO, Once military conflict begins, then the pressure increases for a preemptive launch because the military on each side is tasked to destroy the other side's nuclear weapons. And so, and their military forces and their political leadership and all that. So it's inherently offensive, and it's not, and that's why the U.S. insists on maintaining like 1,500 warheads, because they have to have all these warheads that they can assign to different targets to carry out counterforce targeting. So it all gets back into launch and warhead. It's kind of a long question, but it's...
Counterforce is hitting the other person's missile silos. So they talk about killing the missiles. This is the Pentagon language. Counter value is hitting cities. And that's just collateral damage.
And so if somebody has launched their missiles, are you going to launch your missiles at empty silos? No, you're going to launch them at cities.
And the other thing is that the US satellites radio down to Pine Gap in the middle of Australia, which the US rents for 1 peppercorn per year. And Pine Gap then radios back to Stratcom. So we're right in the middle of it. This is one for Bruce, I think. Agent provocateur makes me wonder if the US is promoting the atrocities of insane Muslims to keep war needed, murderous, or ISIS. And then there's another question on this. A website, usspacecommand.gov, is now shut down. It can be found on the Wayback Machine, but young folks don't know how to search for it. So let's do the agent provocateur.
Could you repeat it, though?
Yeah. Agent provocateur makes me wonder if the US is promoting the atrocities of the Muslims or ISIS to keep war needed. Promoting ISIS, that's the nub of the question.
I think there are many people that are trying to get a handle on the whole ISIS situation. I've been trying to read a lot about it, and I think that at least for me, it's become clear, as I said during my talk, that I believe that ISIS is essentially a creation of the CIA, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and some other governments. And in my mind, the purpose of it is to continually create destabilization, obviously, in the region, and an oil-rich region in the Middle East. I think there's an agenda to redraw some of the national boundaries. We've already seen how Iraq, during the Bush administration, there was talk about balkanizing Iraq, turning it into 3 separate countries, Sunni, Shia, and Kurd, with the Kurds controlling the northern part of Iraq, a very oil-rich area. And that I think this is essentially what's happened in Iraq. And I think now that policy is being extended into Syria and other places, possibly even Turkey, having some of its territory taken from it in this rewriting of the boundaries of the region, even possibly Iran. So anyway, I think there's a lot to think about and to discuss around this whole issue of a larger goal in the region, redrawing lines, controlling oil for particular purposes and for particular profit centers. So I think it's a really important thing. Of course, if you talk about things like that in this country, you're called a conspiracy theorist. And that keeps many people away from, outwardly talking about these kind of things. Just like it's difficult for many people in the peace movement to be critical of US policy encircling Russia, because then you're a Putin sympathizer, or, this recycled red baiting that is being used to make people afraid to be critical of US policy towards Russia. So, I think we have to deal with those slings and arrows that come at us in these kind of moments as we try to understand and really have a reflection, a real serious political reflection on what the broader agenda is. But I think we should not be stymied from going to these places because it's necessary.
Thank you. Bill?
Well, I think the idea of the United States creating, supporting creating or supporting ISIS in some kind of direct way, it makes no sense. I think ISIS is an indirect result in some respects of our invasion of Iraq. The people who were the foundation of that organization really didn't exist until they started fighting the US occupation. So I think there's indirect consequences, but I don't think it's quite as neat and simple, because that would imply that the United States government knows what it's doing. And I think sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So I don't see them as behind every evil in the world. And I think if we look at it that way, we'll miss some things that would be helpful to us in bringing about change.
Thank you. Next question. What's your take on Ashton Carter, who I think I knew as a young man, and I thought he was in the peace movement. Maybe I've got it wrong. He's the new Secretary of Defence. He was on Zelikoff's panel on April '98 in Aspen, talking about catastrophic terrorism, elements of a national policy. So, your take on Ashton Carter. Maybe, Bill, you could start first. Talking to the mic.
Well, Carter has a better reputation than he deserves in a number of respects. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about doing a preemptive strike against North Korea. He's suggested that perhaps invading Iran is not a practical thing to do, so he has no moral opposition, but he wonders what that would unleash. He's very tight with industry, although he talks a good game about how there's too many cost overruns and not enough accountability, and of course the taxpayers should be unhappy about this. But it's kind of like basically saying, yeah, we've had problems, but we're going to solve them, and you just sit back and let us take care of it. So in that sense, I think he may be effective in some small regards, but I don't think he's going to change the course of policy, and he's got some significant negative baggage.
Well, I think he's an opportunist, and I see a lot of corruption in our government everywhere, and I'm afraid he may be another example of it. I hope he proves me wrong.
He's also said already that he supports arming the government in Kiev in their constant onslaught against the self-defense forces in eastern Ukraine. So I think that under his leadership of the War Department, we're going to see increased support for Kiev's war against their own citizens along the Russian border.
I'd like to say something about that too, because it really disturbs me. I've been watching this whole stuff with NATO moving towards Russia, and now what we're basically seeing is a proxy war that the U.S. is fighting against Russia on Russian borders. And there's somehow this idea that we're going to change Russian behavior if we just make things tough enough for them. And how in the hell are we going to do that? NATO's all excited about it, getting 10,000 man force ready when Russia's got 100,000 troops. All that means is that if we get into a shooting war, then somebody's going to either have to back down or somebody's going to use a nuclear weapon. So why can't we think about that? There's no public discussion about this. Once again, these guys don't like to talk about consequences, particularly of nuclear war, so they don't mention nuclear war. They just keep saying, oh yes, well we're gonna get the Russians to change their behavior. Well, it's ridiculous. We have to at least think 2 or 3 steps ahead to what happens. If the Russians don't change their behavior, and somebody in Kiev decides to, bomb Crimea or something, which they seem fully capable of doing at this point. And so that you can tell I find that very upsetting, but I see that as one of the biggest clouds on the horizon right now.
Thank you. This is to all the panel. I think we understand this, but if both US political parties are agreed that nuclear weapons and the military-industrial complex is out of control, I don't know if they do, why are none or few of our representatives making this issue part of their public and political identity? Do you want me to read that again?
Sorry.
If both US political parties are agreed that nuclear weapons and the military-industrial complex is out of control,
Well,
why
right there,
are-
I disagree with the premise. We have bipartisan support right now for arming Kiev. I don't even hear any discussion about it.
yeah.
Maybe that's not military-industrial.
So will that be the
complex,
answer?
but- Yeah, I don't see bipartisan.
What about you, Bill?
Well, there have been times in history when a few members can make a real difference. But they need a strong movement to have the courage to do that. You know, we were talking about the jobs issue. The most important job that a politician cares about is their own job. And so if we had a movement significant enough to take some of these people out of power and put people in who would fight for these issues, I think we might see a different Congress. But we're in a very difficult situation at the moment, and I think we have to think about things we can do in the short term to stop the bleeding, so to speak, and a vision for the longer term of how we're going to turn this country around on this issue. And I think there's members who understand this, who don't have the courage to, you know, stand up and be counted against it in a way that would make a real difference.
Except Bernie Sanders. Not even Elizabeth Warren is talking about it. How do we deal with the fact that the press, which picks its experts, is essentially owned by 5 major corporations? How do we combat that? Go for it, Bruce.
Just in the last 2 weeks, I've been reading interesting stories about Germany. Apparently, a lot of the media in Germany the mainstream media is crashing. One newspaper had to lay off 200 journalists because there have been a whole series of stories throughout Germany about the complicity between the mainstream media and government policy. One writer for the Frankfurter Zeitung, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, I think it is, he announced in a book that he had been a CIA operative for years, and they would hand him a story, he would put his name on it, it would go into the newspaper. And so I believe this was the paper that had to lay off 200 workers. So anyway, there have been a whole series of abandonment of mainstream media in Germany because of similar type stories. That would be great if this information was available in this country. It's not, unfortunately, and we all know the reason why. Thus, I think all the more important our alternative media is here in this country. And we all have to do everything we can to support alternative media and essentially become the media ourselves. If that means blogging or having public access television shows or whatever it takes, we all need to be doing a lot more of that to help transfer this information that we get in little bits and pieces from other parts of the world to the American people, because without that information, the American people are lost. I don't think the American people are stupid. I think the American people are good-hearted, but I think they're just misled and brainwashed. The minds of the American people have been occupied by the corporate agenda, and it's our job to help decolonize the minds of our fellow citizens.
Well, I still like the idea of think globally and act locally. And I think change can happen. Sometimes it can take a long time, and sometimes it can happen overnight. And with the internet and alternative media, we have the ability to reach out and to talk to people. A lot of the whole stuff that we get is designed to make us feel isolated, you know. I remember in a commercial I heard in Australia, and it started off with one person saying, "There's not much I can do, I'm just alone." And more voices joined in until the end of the commercial. There was like 1,000 people going, "I can change the world." You know, I've been talking a lot of negative stuff today. Again, part of it's because I'm a little sick, and I apologize for that. But I do think that there's hope. I wouldn't do this if I didn't think. I'd just go fishing. I'd say, well, the heck of it. But I really think we can change things. And I do think, like Bruce says, I think the people that I know in rural Missouri are basically good-hearted people, and they're just trying to make a living and take care of their families. And maybe that's the way people are everywhere. So somehow we gotta get through to them, and I don't know, I think we can do it, but everybody has to make the decision to do something about it, not let evil prevail and not do anything.
Bill?
Yeah, well, I think if you have the framework and you're reinforced by independent sources, there's nuggets of information you can pull out of mainstream outlets. But absent a framework and information to compare with, it's very difficult to do that. You know, sometimes there's a brilliant little interesting point in paragraph 32 of an article in the New York Times, but first you have to get to paragraph 32, then you have to have something to contrast it with, and to a large extent, when critical voices are heard, it's more like, it's that one quote, nuclear war to begin, critics disagree. It just doesn't, there's not the right balance. And so I think independent media is probably our best hope of upping the ante here, because otherwise, it's sort of like being politically disarmed. I mean, if you don't have the information to bring to the table, it's hard to win political arguments, it's hard to educate your neighbors, it's hard to be a full citizen of a democratic society.
And we'll leave with one rhetorical question before you all go to lunch. I don't understand for the life of me why the New York Times and the Washington Post are promoting the Ukrainian situation, taking the side of Victoria Nuland and Kagan et al., and actively provoking Russia. I don't understand why they would do that. Are they allied with corporations? I mean, they're New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. So think about that. I do not understand what they're up to. All right, it's lunchtime, thank you.
Good job, man.